Okay, we're going to try this again. This is Michelle from Bob Rewards Club. Bob stands for Black-owned businesses. I've been having a lot of technical difficulties, and I realized that the last video that I made was only 2 minutes long, and you guys didn't even get to hear everything that I was saying. So hopefully I'm going to make this video again, and the subject today is talking about Booker T. Washington and the contributions that he made to our Black community, talking briefly about slavery, Civil War, segregation, businesses. The businesses at this time was during the Reconstruction Period, and so that, this is when we had our Black Wall Streets all over the United States, okay? The politics at that time, and then he is the founder of Tuskegee Institute, okay? So before I go ahead, I'm gonna jump to the beginning here, and I want you guys to get familiar with about who Booker T. Washington was himself, okay? So I have downloaded some excerpts from the book Up From Slavery, and it has a narrator. You can get this at Amazon, at Audible, at Amazon if you don't want to get the book Up From Slavery. So just to let you know. Now, I would like for you guys to, if you're not a subscriber of ours, to join our Bob Rewards Club Facebook, and you can also join our club to get discounts at Black-owned businesses across the United States. But go to our website, bobrewards.club, and also go to our YouTube channel, okay? If you're looking at this on Facebook, or if you're looking at this on Twitter, please go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. It is Bob Rewards Club. So please like this video, okay? And as I said, I had some technical difficulties, so like I said, I do want to apologize, but, I think that the topic is very important, that we have this discussion, that, I talk about Booker T. Washington and the contributions that he made to our Black community. And as I said, he is the first Black man who was a legend and legendary, who was about Black economics, okay? So here goes.
This is Audible.
Actually, I am going to skip to the next chapter.
This volume is dedicated to my wife, Mrs. Margaret James Washington, and to my brother, Mr. John H. Washington, whose patience, fidelity, and hard work have gone far to make the work at Tuskegee successful. This volume is the outgrowth of a series of articles dealing with incidents in my life, which were published consecutively in the Outlook. While they were appearing in that magazine, I was constantly surprised at the number of requests which came to me from all parts of the country asking that the articles be permanently preserved in book form. I am most grateful to the Outlook for permission to gratify these requests. I have tried to tell a simple, straightforward story with no attempt at embellishment. My regret is that what I have attempted to do has been done so imperfectly. The greater part of my time and strength is required for the executive work connected with the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, and in securing the money necessary for the support of the institution. Much of what I have said has been written on board trains or at hotels or railroad stations while I have been waiting for trains, or during the moments that I could spare from my work while at Tuskegee, without the exact date of my birth. But at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. As nearly as I have been able to learn, I was born near a crossroads post office called Hales Ford, and the year was 1858 or 1859. I do not know the month or the day. The earliest impressions I can now recall are of the plantation and the slave quarters, the latter being the part of the plantation where the slaves had their cabins. My life had its beginning in the midst of the most miserable, desolate, and discouraging surroundings. This was so, however, not because my owners were especially cruel, for they were not, as compared with many others. I was born in a typical log cabin about 14 by 16 feet square. In this cabin I lived with my mother and a brother and sister till after the Civil War, when we were all declared free. Of my ancestry I know almost nothing. In the slave quarters and even later, I heard whispered conversations among the colored people of the tortures which the slaves, including no doubt my ancestors on my mother's side, suffered in the middle passage of the slave ship, while being conveyed from Africa to America. I have been unsuccessful in securing any information that would throw any accurate light upon the history of my family, beyond my mother. She, I remember, had a half-brother and a half-sister. In the days of slavery, not very much attention was given to family history and family records, that is, black family records. My mother, I suppose, attracted the attention of a purchaser who was afterward my owner and hers. Her addition to the slave family attracted about as much attention as the purchase of a new horse or cow. Of my father, I know even less than of my mother.
He did not
I
know
do not even know his name.
Doesn't even know his
I have heard reports to the effect that he was a white man who lived on one of the nearby plantations. Whoever he was, I never heard of his taking the...
So Booker T. Washington was a mulatto, okay? He was a very handsome man, too, I would say. Very handsome man.
least interest in me or providing in any way for my rearing. But I do not find a special fault with him. He was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution which the nation unhappily had engrafted upon it at that time.
I'm going to skip it a little bit.
Of the fact that it was too small made the room a very uncomfortable one. In addition to these openings, there was in the lower right-hand corner of the room the cat hole, a contrivance which almost every mansion or cabin in Virginia possessed during the antebellum period. The cat hole was a square opening about 7 by 8 inches, provided for the purpose of letting the cat pass in and out of the house at will during the night.
So
in the case of
he
our
was a
particular
slave
cabin,
boy.
I could never understand
As a
the necessity for this convenience.
I'm going to skip this up a little bit, and we're going to get off to... He was a slave boy. His mother was a slave.
Boyhood days.
Tobacco.
After the coming of freedom, there were 2 points upon which practically all the people on our plate agreed. And I find that this was generally true throughout the South. That they must change their names, and that they must leave the old plantation for at least a few days or weeks, in order that they might really feel sure that they were free. In some way, a feeling got among the colored people that it was far from proper for them to bear the surname of their former owners, and a great many of them
This is
took
very
other
important
surnames.
because,
This
remember,
was one of the
slaves
first signs of freedom.
themselves,
When they were
slaves were only called by their first name. And remember, when he talks about when he went to school and how he got the name Washington, that he had made up the name Washington, which came from his stepfather. Okay? So when Booker T. Washington was a young boy, they just called him by his first name.
Slaves, a colored person was simply called John or Susan. There was seldom occasion for more than the use of the one name. If John or Susan belonged to a white man by the name of Hatcher, sometimes he was called John Hatcher, or, as often, Hatcher's John. But there was a feeling that John Hatcher, or Hatcher's John, was not the proper title by which to denote a free man. And so in many cases John Hatcher was changed to John S. Lincoln, or John S. Sherman, the initial S standing for no name, it being simply a part of what the colored man proudly called his entitles. As I have stated, most of the colored people left the old plantation for a short while at least, so as to be sure.
Thank you, P. Wells, for your comment, because he definitely was a hero.
On to see how it felt. After they had remained away for a time, many of the older slaves especially returned to their old homes and made some kind of contract with their former owners by which they remained on the estate. My mother's husband, who was the stepfather of my brother John and myself, did not belong to the same owners as did my mother. In fact, he seldom came to our plantation. I remember seeing him there perhaps once a year, that being about Christmas time. In some way during the war, by running away and following the Federal soldiers, it seems he found his way into the new state of West Virginia. As soon as freedom was declared, he sent for my mother to come to the Kanawha Valley in West Virginia. At that time, a journey from Virginia over the mountains to West Virginia was rather a tedious and, in some cases, a painful undertaking. What little clothing and few household goods we had were placed in a cart, but the children walked the greater portion of the distance, which was several hundred miles. I do not think any of us ever had been very far from the plantation, and the taking of a long journey into another state was quite an event. The parting from our former owners and the members of our own race on the plantation was a serious occasion. From the time of our parting till their death, we kept up a correspondence with the older members of the family, and in later years we have kept in touch with those who were the younger members. We were several weeks making the trip, and most of the time we slept in the open air and did our cooking over a log fire out of doors. One night I recall that we camped near an abandoned log cabin, and my mother decided to build a fire in that for cooking, and afterward to make a pallet on the floor for our sleeping. Just as the fire had gotten well started, a large black snake fully a yard and a half long dropped down the chimney and ran out on the floor. Of course, we at once abandoned that cabin. Finally, we reached our destination, a little town called Malden, which is about 5 miles from Charleston, the present capital of the state. At that time, salt mining was the great industry in that part of West Virginia, and the little town of Malden was right in the midst of the salt furnaces. My stepfather had already secured a job at a salt furnace, and he had also secured a little cabin for us to live in. Our new house was no better than the one we had left on the old plantation in Virginia. In fact, in one respect it was worse. Notwithstanding the poor condition of our plantation cabin, we were at all times sure of pure air. Our new home was in the midst of a cluster of cabins crowded closely together, and as there were no sanitary regulations, the filth about the cabins was often intolerable. Some of our neighbors were colored people, and some were the poorest and most ignorant and degraded white people. It was a motley mixture. Drinking, gambling, quarrels, fights, and shockingly immoral practices were frequent. All who lived in the little town were in one way or another connected with the salt business. Though I was a mere child, my stepfather put me and my brother at work in one of the furnaces. Often I began work as early as 4 o'clock in the morning. The first thing I ever learned in the way of book knowledge was while working in this salt furnace. Each salt packer had his barrels marked with a certain number. The number allotted to my stepfather was 18. At the close of the day...
Okay, so why is this important? Let me tell you why this is important. Okay? Right now, this salt mine has come alive again, okay? And we have over 160-year-old business that had slaves at this salt mine. Here's an article right here from the Atlantic. Okay, the Atlantic is where a lot of your prominent black writers are at writing now. Let's see who wrote this article. It's on here. It's usually at the bottom of the article. Okay, so James Follows wrote this article. He's not a black man. Okay, so here's a cabin. The cabin in Malden, West Virginia, where Booker T. Washington lived from the age 9 until he left for Hampton Institute 7 years later. Okay, so at 16 he left, and this basically Washington's family were slaves, left in blah 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 blah. We already know about all that. So it's come alive again. And we have properties and plantations, tobacco farms, cotton farms, that all need to be part of this ADOS movement, okay? Because we need to get our reparations. And these businesses, even though the people that are working these plantations now are working these businesses now, there's still benefit. This business would have never been around if it wasn't for slave labor. And I think that's very important that we discuss the slave labor here at this time. So you have a historic salt company that has now become alive again here in 2019. Now, this is the article here. It says historic salt company is alive again in Malden. This is Malden, West Virginia. This is 5 miles outside of Charleston. It says in 1851, salt from the Kanawha Valley, as we just heard, Up From Slavery. Again, that's a narrator for his book, Up From Slavery, okay, was awarded the world's best salt at the World's Fair in London. Now, more than 160 years later, one of those old salt companies has been revived by brother and sister Nancy Bruns and Lewis Payne. Last weekend, the J.Q. Dickinson Salt Works celebrated their 1 year. Now, this was in 2014. Okay, this is now 2019. I toured the salt works and talked to sheep, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so here we got salt. It says Nancy Bruns is actually a 7th generation salt maker, but she didn't realize the significance of her family until her husband was researching local history for his master thesis. Do you dig that? You see what I'm saying? And you tell us that we should not get our reparations, people. We have still people in America today that have businesses that they benefited from slavery. But we can't get our reparations? Are you kidding me not? We have businesses that are still in operation today, my people. But we have a difficult time talking about what's owed to us for reparations? I don't think so. I do not think so. I mean, something's got to turn around here. This has got to change. So as I said, we have this woman, Nancy Bruns, who is a 7th generation salt maker from where Booker T. Washington lived. This is where they worked, his family and himself as a young boy. I mean, and I just find it that, we have people that don't want to pay our reparations. Are you kidding me? Not? Come on now. So he was working at the salt industry while I knew the family, blah, blah, blah. You can go take a look at this article yourself if you would like. But, there's not much history here about slavery. I don't see anything here talking about the people who made this company be who they are. All they're talking about is how good this salt is. This salt. Okay? The salt is good on watermelon. The salt is good. This salt. They even give you recipes that you can make with this salt. Okay? This is a slave corporation. And these kind of corporations in America need to be held accountable. They need to be held accountable for the role that they played in not paying the ancestors for the hard labor that they've done. And if they even paid them, they underpaid them, they did sharecropping and all this other bullcrap, they never got a fair wage for the labor, the hard work that they did. And all these years later, these are the people who are the 1%. These are the people that are wealthy over the hard backs of slaves, of black people who struggled and never got a fair wage. And that's very important.
Day's work, the boss of the packers would come around and put 18 on each of our barrels, and I would in some way get enough education to enable me to read common books and newspapers. Soon after we got settled in some manner in our new cabin in West Virginia, I induced my mother to get hold of a book for me. How or where she got it, I do not know. But in some way she procured an old copy of Webster's Blueback Spelling Book, which contained the alphabet, followed by such meaningless words as a, ba, ka, da. I began at once to devour this book, and I think that it was the first one I ever had in my hands. I had learned from somebody that the way to begin to rear fully my ambition, and sympathized with me and aided me in every way that she could, though she was totally ignorant. So far as mere book knowledge was concerned, she had high ambitions for her children and a large fund of good, hard common sense which seemed to enable her to meet and master every situation. If I have done anything in life worth attention, I feel sure that I inherited the disposition from my mother. In the midst of my struggles and longing for an education, a young colored boy who had learned to read in the state of Ohio came to Malden. As soon as the colored people found out that he could read, a newspaper was secured, and at the close of nearly every day's work, this young man would be surrounded by a group of men and women who were anxious to hear him read the news contained in the papers. How I used to envy this man! He seemed to me to be the one young man in all the world who ought to be satisfied with his attainments. About this time, the question of having some kind of a school open for the colored children in the village began to be discussed by members of the race, as it would be the first school for Negro children that had ever been opened in that part of Virginia. It was, of course, to be a great event, and the discussion excited the widest interest. The most perplexing question was where to find a teacher. The young man from Ohio who had learned to read the papers was considered, but his age was against him. In the midst of the discussion about a teacher, Another young colored man from Ohio who had been a soldier in some way found his way into town. It was soon learned that he possessed considerable education, and he was engaged by the colored people to teach their first school. As yet no free schools had been started for colored people in that section. Hence, each family agreed to pay a certain amount per month, with the understanding that the teacher was to board round, that is, spend a day with each family. This was not bad for the teacher, for each family tried to provide the very best on the day the teacher was to be its guest. I recall that I looked forward for an education. As I have stated, it was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn. As fast as any kid in the Sunday school was the spelling book. Day school, night school, Sunday school.
I'm gonna just skip it up a little bit here.
And often many.
Just skip it up a little bit.
Chapter 4. Helping others. At the end of my first year at Hampton, I was confronted with another difficulty.
Let's go back a little
Most
bit.
of the
I want you to
students
hear
went
about
home.
Hampton.
Chapter 3. The Struggle for an Education. One day, while at work in the coal mine, I happened to overhear two miners talking about a great school for colored people somewhere in Virginia. This was the first time that I had ever heard anything about any kind of school or college that was more pretentious than the little colored school in our town. In the darkness of the mine, I noiselessly crept as close as I could to the two men who were talking. I heard one tell the other that not only was the school established for the members of my race, but that opportunities were provided by which poor but worthy students could work out all or a part of the cost of board, and at the same time be taught some trade or industry. As they went on describing the school, it seemed to me that it must be the greatest place on earth, and not even heaven presented more.
You have to remember, too, at this time, it was the black people at this time who had the skills, okay? And he talks about that in his memoirs here. He talks about how it was the white people, they didn't have any type of trade. They didn't know how to be carpenters, to be blacksmiths, and so on, okay? And it was during this time, was our great time because we knew how to build. We knew how to make bricks. We knew how to do all these things to build up America. It wasn't the white people that knew how to do this. Okay? And so they were devastated. They were literally devastated by the fact that slavery now has ended. We have nobody who's going to work our plantations. All of our economic resources are now depleted. Can you imagine how these people thought at this time? Okay? And this is when black people, because of Jim Crow, because of segregation, black businesses flourished. This was a time and period, again, as I've said in other videos, that black people, we couldn't just walk down to the store and go to a white establishment. We couldn't go to white schools. Okay? This was a segregated Jim Crow period. And then, as they saw later on, when we have W.E.B. Du Bois, we have this whole thing with integration. Okay? And that's how come Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois did not get along, because we have a segregationist versus integrationalist who we can see now from statistics that our wealth is the same as during the Reconstruction period that we have today in 2019 or less. We are not as wealthy of a people if we're taking the time and comparing apples to apples. Back at that time, we are not as wealthy of a people. So economics was very important, and Booker T. Washington, he knew that. Now, him being a slave boy made him a little bit vulnerable, and he didn't have anybody that he could have as an ally from the black community at that time. Okay? But he became a legend. He was notorious and was known for the contribution that he did give to the development of the first National Negro Business League. Now it's called the National Business League. They've taken out the Negro. It's not black. It's not Negro. It's not colored. It's not any of that.
More attractions for me at that time than did the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, about which these men were talking. I resolved at once to go to that school, although I had no idea where it was, or how many miles away, or how I was going to reach it. I remembered only that I was on fire constantly with one ambition, and that was to go to Hampton. This thought was with me day and night. After hearing of the Hampton Institute, I continued to work for a few months longer in the coal mine. While at work there, I heard of a vacant position in the household of General Lewis Ruffner, the owner of the salt furnace and coal mine. Mrs. Viola Ruffner, the wife of General Ruffner, was a Yankee woman from Vermont. Mrs. Ruffner had a reputation all through the vicinity for being very strict with her servant.
And remember I told you guys, it is upwards of thinking. Statistically, I know in some cities such as Charleston, South Carolina, and some cities across the United States, where upmost of about 70% of the slave owners were white Jews at that time. So these people that he built bridges with were actually had slaves themselves, okay? And they benefited from slavery. And see, Booker T. Washington was a legend because he was well known across the world for what he had done, for his intelligence, his activism, his education, okay? Because, even he talked about all the famous people, the presidents he was advisors to. And so he was a legend. He was a legend, okay? So I just want you guys to be aware of that.
And especially with the boys who tried to serve her. Few of them had remained with her more than 2 or 3 weeks. They all left with the same excuse: she was too strict. I decided, however, that I would rather try Mrs. Ruffner's house than remain in the coal mine, and so my mother applied to her for the vacant position. I was hired at a salary of $5 per month. I had heard so much about Mrs. Ruffner's severity that I was almost afraid to see her, and trembled when I went into her presence. I had not lived with her many weeks, however, before I began to understand her. I soon began to learn that, first of all, she wanted everything kept clean about her, that she wanted things done promptly and systematically, and that at the bottom of everything she wanted absolute honesty and frankness. Nothing must be sloven or slipshod. Every door, every fence must be kept in repair. I cannot now recall how long I lived with Mrs. Ruffner before going to Hampton, but I think it must have been a year and a half. At any rate, I here repeat what I have said more than once before, that the lessons that I have learned in the home of Mrs. Ruffner were as valuable to me as any education I have ever gotten anywhere since. Even to this day, I never see bits of paper scattered around a house or in the street that I do not want to pick them up at once. I never see a filthy yard that I do not want to clean it, a paling off of a fence that I do not want to put it on, an unpainted or unwhitewashed house that I do not want to paint or whitewash it, or a button off one's clothes, or a grease spot on them or on a floor that I do not want to call attention to it. From fearing Mrs. Ruffner, I soon learned to look upon her as one of my best friends. When she found that she could trust me, she did so implicitly. During the 1 or 2 winters that I was with her, she gave me an opportunity to go to school for an hour in the day during a portion of the winter months, but most of my studying was done at night, sometimes alone, sometimes under someone whom I could hire to teach me. Mrs. Ruffner always encouraged and sympathized with me in all my efforts to get an education. It was while living with her that I began to get together my first library. I secured a dry goods box, knocked out one side of it, put some shelves in it, and began putting into it everything that anyone thoroughly sympathized with me in my ambition to go to Hampton, unless it was my mother, and she was troubled with a...
And remember, he walked almost 500 miles to Hampton, Virginia, to the Hampton Institute, which was started again by a general, okay, a white general. Most of your HBCUs were started by white people, okay, and it's good to know too that in case you don't know about a lot of your HBCUs, a lot of your HBCUs at that time, like Howard, Bennett College, Hampton, they had mulattoes. A lot of them were mulattoes. These were the kids of the slave owners, okay? And so a lot of them were freed slaves too. So that's what the HBCUs made up of. So that's why if you were to go take a look at, I'm going to try to find you guys some pictures, a lot of the people who attended these schools, they're very light-skinned and they're very fine-haired, okay? And so that they were actually your mulattoes. It was your mulatto class that became your black boule at this time. So I'm going to continue on.
Brave fear that I was
again, this is
starting
from
out
Up from Slavery.
on a wild goose chase. At any rate, I got only a half-hearted consent from her that I might start. The small amount of money that I had earned had been consumed by my stepfather and the remainder of the family, with the exception of a very few dollars, and so I had very little with which to buy clothes and pay my traveling expenses. My brother John helped me all that he could, but of course that was not a great deal, for his work was in the coal mine, where he did not earn much, and most of what he did earn went in the direction of paying the household expenses. Perhaps the thing that touched and pleased me most in connection with my starting for Hampton was the interest that many of the older colored people took in the matter. They had spent the best days of their lives in slavery, and hardly expected to live to see the time when they would see a member of their race leave home to attend a boarding school. Some of these older people would give me a nickel, others a quarter, or a handkerchief. Finally, the great day came, and I started for Hampton. I had only a small, cheap satchel that contained what few articles of clothing I could get. My mother at the time was rather weak and broken in health. I hardly expected to see her again, and thus our parting was all the more sad. She, however, was very brave through it all. At that time there were no through trains connecting that part of West Virginia with Eastern Virginia. Trains ran only a portion of the way, and the remainder of the distance was traveled by stagecoaches. The distance from Malden to Hampton is about 500 miles. I had not been away from home many hours before it began to grow painfully evident that I did not have enough money to pay my fare to Hampton. One experience I shall long remember. I had been traveling over the mountains most of the afternoon in an old-fashioned stagecoach, when late in the evening the coach stopped for the night at a common, unpainted house.
Now, I find this story to be very interesting, and I love his recanter of the whole story. So listen to this.
Called a hotel. All the other passengers except myself were whites. In my ignorance, I supposed that the little hotel existed for the purpose of accommodating the passengers who traveled on the stagecoach. The difference that the color of one's skin would make I had not thought anything about. After all the other passengers had been shown rooms and were getting ready for supper, I shyly presented myself before the man at the desk. It is true I had practically no money in my pocket with which to pay for bed or food, but I had hoped in some way to beg my way into the good graces of the landlord. For at that season in the mountains of Virginia the weather was cold, and I wanted to get indoors for the night. Without asking as to whether I had any money, the man at the desk firmly refused to even consider the matter of providing me with food or lodging. This was my first experience in finding out what the color of my skin meant.
This was his first time learning what the color of his skin meant.
Some way I managed to keep warm by walking about, and so got through the night. My whole soul was so bent upon reaching Hampton that I did not have time to cherish any bitterness towards the hotel keeper. By walking, begging rides both in wagons and in the cars, in some way after a number of days, I reached the city of Richmond, Virginia, about 82 miles from Hampton. When I reached there, tired, hungry, and dirty, it was late in the night. I had never been in a large city, and this rather added to my misery. When I reached Richmond, I was completely out of money. I had not a single acquaintance in the place, and being unused to city ways, I did not know where to go. I applied at several places for lodging, but they all wanted money, and that was what I did not have. Knowing nothing else better to do, I walked the streets. In doing this, I passed by many food stands where fried chicken and half-moon apple pies were piled high and made to present a most tempting appearance. At that time it seemed to me that I would have promised all that I expected to possess in the future to have gotten hold of one of those chicken legs or one of those pies. But I could not get either of these, nor anything else to eat. I must have walked the streets till after midnight. At last I became so exhausted that I could walk no longer. I was tired, I was hungry, I was everything but discouraged. Just about the time when I reached extreme physical exhaustion, I came upon a portion of a street where the board sidewalk was considerably elevated. I waited for a few minutes till I was sure that no passers-by could see me, and then crept under the sidewalk and lay for the night upon the ground with my satchel of clothing for a pillow. Nearly all night I could hear the tramp of feet over my head. The next morning I found myself somewhat refreshed, but I was extremely hungry because it had been a long time since I had had sufficient food. As soon as it became light enough for me to see my surroundings, I noticed that I was near a large ship, and that this ship seemed to be unloading a cargo of pig iron. I went at once to the vessel and
All right, let's skip it to
Chapter 5, The Reconstruction Period.
Okay, I find this very important.
The years from 1867 to 1878, I think, may be called the period of Reconstruction. This included the time that I spent as a student at Hampton and as a teacher in West Virginia. During the whole of the Reconstruction period, two ideas were constantly agitating the minds of the colored people, or at least the minds of a large part of the race. One of these was the craze for Greek and Latin learning, and the other was a desire to hold office. It could not have been expected that a people who had spent generations in slavery, and before that generations in the darkest heathenism, could at first form any proper conception of what an education meant. In every part of the South during the Reconstruction period, schools, both day and night, were filled to overflowing with people of all ages and conditions, some being as far along in age as 60 and 70 years. The ambition to secure an education was most praiseworthy and encouraging. The idea, however, was too prevalent that as soon as one secured a little education, in some unexplainable way he would be free from most of the hardships of the world, and at any rate could live without manual labor. There was a further feeling that a knowledge, however little, of the Greek and Latin languages would make one a very superior human being, something bordering almost on the supernatural. I remember that the first colored man whom I saw, who knew something about foreign languages, impressed me at that time as being a man of all others to be envied. Naturally, most of our people who received some little education became...
All right, so I want to point out something here that I think is very important, that a lot of Black people, especially younger Black people, don't realize that we have been in politics basically since after slavery, okay, and even before. We had Black politicians. And that was even before the right to vote. And that was because there were a lot of Black people. There was a lot of Black people that were living in this country. I mean, in upwards, we made up of more than 50% at certain times of history in this country. There were more Black slaves in this country than there were white people or any other group in this country. Okay? And so I think that's very important that you understand that we had Black politicians since the, according to this, going all the way back to 1746 with Wentworth Cheswell. Okay? And we had Black, oh my goodness, I hope my screen didn't go out. I'm not having another technical problem. And it looks like I am. So here we go again. Okay, here I go again. Just having all kinds of technical problems. I don't know if it's my multi-streaming that I do. By the way, if you guys are looking at this, please go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. It is Bob, B-O-B, as you can see back there, Bob Rewards Club, okay? And subscribe. It doesn't cost anything to do that. So please subscribe, share, and like this video, okay? This video is educational today. I am talking about Booker T. Washington and the contribution that he did to the Black community. Despite some of the opposition or people who might not think highly of Booker T himself, he was a legend, and he was the first Black man in our community who was acknowledged for the contributions that he did for Black businesses, okay? And he was about economics. He would be considered a conservative today. However, I would not put him in the same classification And let's see if I'm still going. Yes, I am. I wouldn't put him as in the same classification as some of your black leaders today, because of the fact that he was really invested in his black community. He wanted to educate the other slaves or the other children of slaves that could not read and they couldn't write. Okay, and he just really was invested in his black community. Now, as I was saying, and I've said, I've had to make this video now a few times, but that's what I'm talking about here today. I think it's very important. As I was saying, that W.E.D. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, they opposed each other. W.E.D. Du Bois was an integrationist. He believed in integration like Martin Luther King versus, okay, when we were compared from now until then, versus Booker T. Washington. He was a segregationist, okay? And so it's kind of like Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, versus, and we say Booker T. Washington versus W.E.D. Du Bois. So there are plus and there are cons to both of them. There are pros and cons to both of them. I mean, as I was saying, that we know that our economics, in terms of our wealth, has declined since that time. And we're talking, this is back in 1865 through 1878, 1877, somewhere around there was the Reconstruction period. But however, I would even say that Reconstruction period and the time that we had black businesses and all of that growth was for the next 30 years up until the Depression, okay? Next 30, 40 years, okay? So, these are just things that, I'm bringing out, and I think it's important that you understand that we had black politicians all the way up until the time that from 1746 we had people that were representing us. But the bulk of them during like 1870, 1871 is where you find a lot of black politicians, okay, a lot of your House of Reps. And so I'm going to go ahead and continue on with
Teachers
Up from Slavery.
While among these two classes there were many capable, earnest, godly men and women, still a large proportion took up teaching or preaching as an easy way to make a living. Many became teachers who could do little more than write their names. I remember there came into our neighborhood one of this class who was in search of a school to teach, and the question arose while he was there as to the shape of the earth and how he would teach the children concerning this subject. He explained his position in the man who learned to read would receive a call to preach, would receive a call, if he were inclined to resist the summon. Chapter 6. Black Race and Red Race. During the year that I spent in Washington, and for some little time before this, there had been considerable agitation in the state of West Virginia over the question of moving the capital of the state from Wheeling to some other central point. As a result of this, the legislature designated 3 cities to be voted upon by the citizens of the state as the permanent seat of government. Among these cities was Charleston, only 5 miles from Malden, my home. At the close of my school year in Washington, I was very pleasantly surprised to receive from a committee of white people in Charleston an invitation to canvass the state in the interests of that city. This invitation I accepted, and spent nearly 3 months in speaking in various parts of the state. Charleston was successful in winning the prize and is now the permanent seat of government. The reputation that I made as a speaker during this campaign induced a number of persons to make an earnest effort to get me to enter political life, but I refused, still believing that I could find other service which would prove of more permanent value to my race. Even then, I had a strong feeling that what our people most needed was to get a foundation in education, industry, and property, and for this, I felt that they could better afford to strive than for political
Sorry
preferment.
for the technical problems.
As for my individual self, it appeared to me to be reasonably certain that I could succeed in political life. But I had a feeling that it would be a rather selfish kind of success. Individual success at the cost of failing to do my duty in assisting in laying a foundation for the masses. At this period in the progress of our race, a very large proportion of the young men who went to school or to college did so with the express determination to prepare themselves to be great lawyers or congressmen, and many of the women planned to become music teachers. But I had a reasonably fixed idea, even at that early period in my life, that there was need for something to be done to prepare the way for successful lawyers, congressmen, and music teachers. I felt that the conditions were a good deal like those of an old colored man during the days of slavery who wanted to learn how to play on the guitar. In his desire to take guitar lessons, he applied to one of his young masters to teach him. But the young man, not having much faith in the ability of the slave to master the guitar at his age, sought to discourage him by telling him, "Uncle Jake, I will give you guitar lessons, but Jake, I will have to charge you $3 for the first lesson, $2 for the second lesson, and one pleasant surprise." This was a letter from General Armstrong inviting me to return to Hampton at the next commencement to deliver what was called the Postgraduate Address. This was an honor the whole distance in the train.
He was the one that
I was
started
constantly
Hampton.
contrasting this with my first
Armstrong.
journey to Hampton.
General
I think I may
Armstrong.
say, without seeming egotism, that it is seldom any other institution then in existence. But every improvement was made under the
I'm going to play
magnificent
one
leadership
more
of General
chapter
Armstrong,
of
solely
Up
with
from
the
Slavery,
view of leading and helping the
and
needs of our
that
people.
had to do with his trip to Europe. And then
Chapter 16, Europe.
Okay, it's chapter 16.
In 1893, I was married to Miss Margaret James Murray, a native of Mississippi and a graduate of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, who had come to Tuskegee as a teacher several years before, and at the time we were married was filling the position of lady principal. Not only is Mrs. Washington completely one with me in the work directly connected with the school, relieving me of many burdens and perplexities, but aside from her work on the school grounds, she carries on a mothers' meeting in the town of Tuskegee, and a plantation work among the women, children, and men who live in a settlement connected with a large plantation about 8 miles from Tuskegee. Both the mothers' meeting and the plantation work are carried on not only with a view to helping those who are directly reached, but also for the purpose of furnishing object lessons in these two kinds of work that may be followed by our students when they go out into the world for their own life work. Aside from these two enterprises, Mrs. Washington is also largely responsible for a woman's club at the school, which brings together twice a...
So, as you can see on my screen here, I'm showing you, this was an event, a picture that was taken in 1909. This was in Louisville, Kentucky. Okay, now remember, we had Black Wall Streets that were all over the United States. Okay, and the picture that you see here, this was in 1909. Okay. And these are all people that were businesses. They were black businesses. But a lot of them, as you can see, they were mulatto. Okay. I mean, you can clearly see the fine hair. And you can see, like, even this guy here, he doesn't even look black to me at all. This Dr. Courtney is a well-known public spirited citizen. He was a physician in Massachusetts. Okay. The first meeting of the founders of the National Negro Business League in 1900 was held in his home. From the inception of the movement, he has been one of its leading directors as members of the executive committee. Okay. He was also born in Malden, West Virginia in 1855. And he received his early education in the public school, of which Booker T. Washington was the teacher. So, you see the relationship there. Okay? So, but he clearly looks like a mulatto man. All right? And so I just wanted to point that out, that the role that mulattoes have played and the hit, with blacks is extensive. And I know some of us have a problem with mulattoes and some of us don't, but they've always been considered black. Okay. And I say this because, I take part in other people's podcasts and as a black YouTuber now, and I know one of the discussions that is usually had has to do with the fact of mulattoes, and some mulattoes are not, and now I think the role mulattoes, and this is for another heavy discussion in the future, but the role that, mulattoes play in the black community is important, whether or not they actually are taking upon our black culture, or if they're not consider themselves as black, as some mulattoes as we see today do, okay, then we cannot, we cannot take part in that, okay? And that's all I got to say about that. But, we cannot, that is not right that they want to represent us when they want to represent us, and if they when it's good for them. So I think that's an issue here. But as you can see, there have been mulattoes that have been a great benefit to our group. And I think that's important to say, that not all mulattoes have betrayed our group. Okay? And I think that we get a lot of negativity, like I say, with a lot of black YouTubers talking about the what mulattoes have done. And there have been some mulattoes all throughout history, even before this time, as I said, who have hurt the group. So I just kind of wanted to point that out.
A month, the women who live on the school grounds and those who live near, for the discussion of some important topic. She is also the president of what is known as the Federation of Southern Colored Women's Clubs, and is chairman of the executive committee of the National Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. Portia, the oldest of my 3 children, has learned dressmaking. She has unusual ability in instrumental music. Aside from her studies at Tuskegee, she has already begun to teach there. Booker Taliaferro is my next oldest child. Young as he has already nearly mastered the brick mason's trade. He began working at this trade when he was quite small, dividing his time between this and classwork, and he has developed great skill in the trade and a fondness for it. He says that he is going to be an architect and brick mason. One of the most satisfactory letters that I have ever received from anyone came to me from Booker last summer. When I left home for the summer, I told him that he must work at his trade half of each day, and that the other half of the day he could spend as he pleased. When I had been away from home 2 weeks, I received the following letter from him. Tuskegee, Alabama. My dear Papa, before you left home, you told me to work at my trade half of each day. I like my work so much that I want to work at my trade all day. Besides, I want to earn all the money I can, so that when I go to another school, I shall have money to pay my expenses. Your son, Booker. My youngest child, Ernest Davidson Washington, says that he's going to be a physician. In addition to going to school, where he studies books and his manual training, he regularly spends a portion of his time in the office of our resident physician, and has already learned to do many of the duties which pertain to a doctor's office. The thing in my life which brings me the keenest regret is that my work in connection with public affairs keeps me so much of the time away from my family, where, of all places in the world, I delight to be. I always envy the individual whose life work is so laid that he can spend his evenings at home. I have sometimes thought that people who have this rare privilege do not appreciate it as they should. It is such a rest and relief to get away from crowds of people and handshaking and traveling and get home, even if it be for but a very brief while. Another thing at Tuskegee out of which I get a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction is in the meeting with our students and teachers and their families in the chapel for devotional exercises every evening at 8:30, the last thing before retiring for the night. It is an inspiring sight when one stands on the platform there and sees before him 11 or 1200 earnest young men and women. And one cannot but feel that it is a privilege to help to guide them to a higher and more useful life. In the spring of 1899, there came to me what I might describe as almost the greatest surprise of my life. Some good ladies in Boston arranged a public meeting in the interest of Tuskegee to be held in the Hollis Street Theater. This meeting was attended by large numbers of the best people of Boston of both races. Bishop Lawrence presided. In addition to an address made by myself, Dr. Paul Lawrence Dunbar read from his poems, and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois read an original sketch. Some of those who attended this meeting noticed that I seemed unusually tired, and some little time after the close of the meeting, one of the ladies who had been interested in it asked me in a casual way if I had ever been to Europe. I replied that I never had. She asked me if I had ever thought of going, and I told her no, that it was something entirely beyond me. This conversation soon passed out of my mind, but a few days afterward I was informed that some friends in Boston, including Mr. Francis J. Garrison, had raised a sum of money sufficient to pay all the expenses of Mrs. Washington and myself during a 3 or 4 months' trip to Europe. It was added with emphasis that we must go. A year previous to this, Mr. Garrison had attempted to get me to promise to go to Europe for a summer's rest, with the understanding that he would be responsible for raising the money among his friends for the expenses of the trip. At that time, such a journey seemed so entirely foreign to anything I should ever be able to undertake that I confess I did not give the matter very serious attention. But later Mr. Garrison joined his efforts to those of the ladies whom I have mentioned. And when their plans were made known to me, Mr. Harrison not only had the route mapped out, but had, I believe,
now I want to point out
something
something here.
We were to sail. The whole thing
Remember,
was so
there
sudden.
were, and as there is still today, you had white men who had less than a quarter African American in them, and that's how come you see this thing that we're passing for black, but they were actually white. Okay, and that's just to be the benefits or either to infiltrate or whatever. But I do notice here, because what I'm showing you guys here on the screen is the register of all the people at this meeting in that picture. This was in 1909. Okay. These were people that were part of the National Negro Business League, okay, which is now called the National Business League, but it's not. It's totally different. It is now, it is 2017, as I said in some of the earliest. We had a lot of technical problems today. That it is now ran by the Black Chamber of Commerce in Michigan, and they bought it in 2017, and so all they have is a landing page now. So what they're trying to do with it, they are trying to bring it back to where it was back in 1900, where Booker T. Washington had it, some way, somehow. Again, that's a whole nother discussion, but hopefully we can partner with them here to help them out. So.
And so unexpected that I was completely taken off my feet. I had been at work steadily for 18 years in connection with Tuskegee, and I had never thought of anything else but ending my life in that way. Each day the school seemed to depend upon me more largely for its daily expenses, and I told these Boston friends that while I thanked them sincerely for their thoughtfulness and generosity, I could not go to Europe for the reason that the school could not live financially while I was absent. They then informed me that Mr. Henry L. Higginson and some other good friends, who I know do not want their names made public, were then raising a sum of money which would be sufficient to keep the school in operation while I was away. At this point, I was compelled to surrender. Every avenue of escape had been closed. Deep down in my heart, the whole thing seemed more like a dream than like reality, and for a long time it was difficult for me to make myself believe that I was actually going to Europe. I had been born and largely reared in the lowest depths of slavery, ignorance, and poverty. In my childhood I had suffered for want of a place to sleep, for lack of food, clothing, and shelter. I had not had the privilege of sitting down to a dining table until I was quite well grown. Luxuries had always seemed to me to be something meant for white people, not for my race. I had always regarded Europe and London and Paris much as I regarded heaven. And now could it be that I was actually going to Europe? Such thoughts as these were constantly with me. Two other thoughts troubled me a good deal. I feared that people who heard that Mrs. Washington and I were going to Europe might not know all the circumstances and might get the idea that we had become, as some might say, stuck up and were trying to show off. I recall that from my youth I had heard it said that too often, when people of my race reached any degree of success, they were inclined to unduly exalt themselves, to try to ape the wealth, and in so doing to lose their heads. The fear that people might think this of us haunted me a good deal. Then, too, I could not see how my conscience would permit me to spare the time from my work and be happy. It seemed mean and selfish in me to be taking a vacation while others were at work, and while there was so much that needed to be done. From the time I could remember, I had always been at work, and I did not see how I could spend 3 or 4 months in doing nothing. The fact was that I did not know how to take a vacation. Mrs. Washington had much the same difficulty in getting away, but she was anxious to go because she thought that I needed the rest. There were many important national questions bearing upon the life of the race which were being agitated at that time, and this made it all the harder for us to decide to go. We finally gave our Boston friends our promise that we would go, and then they insisted that the date of our departure be set as soon as possible. So we decided upon May 10th. My good friend Mr. Garrison kindly took charge of all the details necessary for the success of the trip, and he, as well as other friends, gave us a great number of letters of introduction to people in France and England, and made our arrangements for our comfort and convenience abroad. Goodbyes were said at Tuskegee, and we were in New York May 9th, ready to sail the next day. Our daughter, Portia, who was then studying in South Framingham, Massachusetts, came to New York to see us off. Mr. Scott, my secretary, came with me to New York in order that I might clear up the last bit of business before I left. Other friends also came to New York to see us off. Just before we went on board the steamer, another pleasant surprise came to us.
So I just want to kind of reiterate there. I'm going to kind of end it there. This is Michelle talking about the contributions that Booker T. Washington gave to our Black community. He's a legend, as you well know, for the bridges that he built. Okay, and he built quite a bit of them. As I was saying in another podcast, how Booker T. Washington, some of your most renowned, wealthiest, rich people, and some of those were slave owners, okay? And your presidents, Booker T. Washington knew they had him highly in favor. They liked him. They supported Tuskegee. They gave him thousands and thousands of dollars. The Rockefellers and all of them, they gave him thousands and thousands of dollars, okay? But he's a legend because he did think about his Black community and represented it well back at that time, in the racism and all the stuff that he experienced to get where he was a legend. So I'm going to kind of end it there. As you can see, as I was showing you pictures of some of the people that are representative in the picture here, that attended this conference that they had. That was in 1909. Okay, I was reading their bios. Their bios were put in a book, and so if you want to take a look at that, you definitely can go online to find that information, as well as you can go listen or read the book Up From Slavery, which are memoirs from Booker T. Washington himself. My gosh, those speakers are terrible. I've got a couple computers set up, you guys. One of them has some really bad speakers that I just recently got from Amazon. But you know what? You can't buy everything from Amazon. So listen, I want to thank you guys. I know this got broken up into 5 different pieces here, but if you guys took the time to join me today and look at this and parts of it, thank you so much. Okay, again, join, like, subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're not a member right now, we need more YouTube subscriptions. Okay, I just started this YouTube thing a few months back, but I think it could be very useful from this voice where we talk about the contributions to Black business here in this country, looking at history, also looking at Black business entertainers today. I do another podcast. I didn't do it yesterday because I was doing a lot of research on Booker T himself. And so, join me. I love to have you to join me to, where we can both learn and do the research ourselves to learn more about, as I said, things that impact our Black community and legends of our Black community. So have a good day, and thanks again.